The interviewer arrived at the medical bay on the third day, when Myra Dane could finally sit upright without the support rails. He was Vethiri, the gray-skinned, soft-bodied species that ran most of the Kethavoss Ascent Authority, their 4 eye clusters arranged in a crown that let them read a room without turning their heads. This one had the measured movements of someone who processed difficult information for a living. He set a recording apparatus on the table between them, introduced himself as Compliance Officer Dresh, and informed Myra that her deposition was required under Article 14 of the Joint Expedition Accord. She told him to start recording. Her hands were wrapped from palm to mid-forearm, both of them, in the pale polymer bandaging the station medical staff used for deep frostbite. 3 toes on her left foot had been removed 2 days ago. The surgeon, also Vethiri, had been soft-spoken and clinical, and visibly unsettled by the fact that Myra had discussed the procedure with him in the same register she used for meal orders. He had reviewed the relevant human anatomy 3 times before touching her, and she had answered his questions in a flat, precise sequence that he later described to a colleague as the most orderly pre-surgical conversation he had ever conducted. Dresh noted the bandaging. He noted the removed toes. He consulted his records, which told him that 17 people had registered for the Kethavoss summit attempt, and that Myra Dane was the only name on the return manifest. He asked her to begin at the beginning. She said it wasn't the storm that killed them. The storm just finished it. The climb had been organized through the Authority, 9 alien clients, 7 alien guides, and 1 human specialist attached as a high-altitude consultant. The human's name on the contract was Myra Dane, age 22, license class 14 terrain specialist, certified for environments the Authority graded as extreme with capital letters and genuine concern. She had been hired because Kethavoss's upper face had a kilometer of mixed terrain that the standard Vethiri guide programs had been losing clients on for a decade, and someone in the Authority's procurement division had finally admitted this in writing and authorized an outside hire. Kethavoss itself sat at the center of a continental uplift on a world Myra privately classified as Class 10, harsh enough to kill you through sustained exposure, not harsh enough to make killing you interesting. The peak crested at 9,000 meters. The air above 7,000 was thin enough that the Authority required supplemental thermal and respiratory systems for all non-human personnel. The cold above 8,000 was the kind that Vethiri medical literature described as unsurvivable beyond 90 minutes of unprotected exposure. Myra had gone up without supplemental systems. The Authority had flagged this in 3 separate pre-expedition advisories. She had signed each one. At summit camp, 8,400 meters, the storm front arrived 6 hours ahead of the forecast window. It came from the southeast, wrong direction for every model the meteorology staff had been running, and it hit the upper face while 11 of the 17 climbers were still above the last safe shelter band. Dresh asked, what were conditions at that point? Myra said, visibility dropped to 4 meters in the first 10 minutes. Wind gusts between 70 and 90 kilometers per hour, effective temperature somewhere around -51. She looked at her wrapped hands resting on the table, cold enough that the supplemental system seals were failing. The units weren't designed for that differential. Dresh made a notation. He asked who was closest to the shelter band when the storm hit. Tuvek and his 2 clients were below me. They made it down, the rest didn't. She had been at 8,600 when the wind went wrong, above the last shelter band, below the summit, in the section of the route the guides called the collar because of the way the ridge compressed the wind into a focused channel. She had been guiding 2 clients, a Vethiri corporate executive named Shorvith and a senior academic named Previn. Both had supplemental units. Both units failed within 40 minutes of the storm's arrival. Shorvith lost consciousness first. She had him anchored to a fixed line when his readings went critical, and she spent 11 minutes attempting to restore his unit's thermal function with her bare hands because her gloves were too thick for the contact points. The unit did not respond. She secured him as well as the ground allowed, noted his precise position in the shared channel, and kept climbing. She was still going up. Dresh paused the recording. He asked her to clarify that. She said the shelter band was below me. The summit was above me. If I went down, I was going down in that wind for 300 meters of exposed ridge in zero visibility. If I went up, I had 100 meters to the call, where there was a fixed shelter unit built into the rock. You were still ascending, Dresh said, in those conditions. I was moving toward shelter. He restarted the recording. Previn died somewhere in the next 60 meters. She knew because his biometric tag went flat on her wrist display, and she stopped long enough to verify it wasn't a transmission error. It was. She kept moving. The wind at the collar was the kind that had weight, not a metaphor, a physical fact. It pushed with enough lateral force that forward motion meant angling into it at 15 degrees, and accepting that every third step was a net loss in ground. She counted steps because counting made the steps happen. She did not think about Shorvith on the line below her. She did not think about Previn's flat reading. She thought about the next fixed anchor, which was somewhere ahead in the white, and then the one after that. At some point in those final meters, she stopped feeling the wind as wind. It became a surface instead, something she moved along rather than through, a wall she kept her left shoulder pressed against because the alternative was the open face and the drop she couldn't see the bottom of. The cold was doing something to her face that she catalogued without reacting to. The skin over her cheekbones had passed through pain and out the other side into a dull, pressurized absence, the same transition her hands had made when she'd been working Shorvith's unit barehanded. She noted it. She filed it. She moved. Her ice axe found the next anchor by sound before she saw it, the different ring of steel on fixed hardware rather than rock. She clipped in with fingers that registered the action without confirming it, relying on the mechanical click because sensation in the tips was no longer available for confirmation. 20 seconds. Breathe. Move. The world had narrowed to a sequence. Anchor, clip, step, anchor. Everything outside that sequence had been stripped away, not by the storm but by the part of her that understood survival as a problem of scope. Reduce it far enough and it becomes solvable. Keep it small. Keep it moving. The shelter unit at the call took her 47 minutes to reach. She found 2 other climbers inside, a pair of Vethiri guides who had pushed from higher on the route and made the shelter ahead of her. Yethais and Kavrin. Both were in the terminal stages of core temperature failure, their supplemental units drained, and their species, narrow thermal tolerance, breached past the point the literature called unsurvivable without intervention. Yethais was still conscious. She worked on him for 20 minutes with the shelter unit's emergency heat elements and the contents of the medical kit, following the Vethiri emergency protocol from the laminated card on the wall because she had memorized it before the climb. His readings stabilized, briefly. Then they didn't. She did not have a good explanation for what she felt during those 20 minutes, she told Dresh. She was not afraid and she was not angry. She was doing the thing in front of her with the tools available. When the tools stopped being enough, she noted it and moved to the next decision. Kavrin had died before she reached the shelter. She was alone in the call at 8,500 meters, with a storm that the authorities' models had not predicted, and a descent route she could not verify in 4 meters of visibility. Her biometric log, which she had reviewed in the medical bay over the last 3 days, showed her core temperature at that point was 35.2 degrees. The standard literature marked 35 as the onset of clinical hypothermia. She ate 2 nutrition blocks from the shelter kit. She drank half the water bladder. She checked the fixed line map against her position and committed the route to memory. Then she spent 4 minutes recording the positions of Yethys and Kavrin into the shared emergency channel. Elevation, precise bearing from the shelter anchor, personal identifier tags. Because whatever happened next, she did not want the recovery teams searching blind across 900 square meters of open face. When she was finished, she sat for exactly 60 seconds. She counted them. She did not allow herself more. Then she started down. Dresh asked, how long was the descent? 11 hours. He reviewed something in his records. The storm maintained winds above 60 kilometers per hour for the first 7 of those hours. Yes. Your exposed skin time by your own biometric log exceeded 4 hours. The gloves failed at hour 3. I was doing the anchor work barehanded from that point. He was quiet for a moment. His crown of eye clusters shifted in the pattern Myra had come to associate with Vethiri discomfort. Not distress exactly, but the processing expression, the one that meant incoming information was being held against some internal model, and the model was not holding. She continued without being asked. She had fallen twice on the upper face, once on a fixed line section where ice had formed over the anchor hardware and her hand slipped, and once on a traverse where she misread the angle in the white and went sideways. The first fall arrested after 4 meters. The second was longer. She did not know how long. She stopped on a rock edge she felt before she saw, and she hung there with her face against the stone and the wind pressing her flat against it. The wind said stop. The cold said stop. Her biometric log would later show that her heart rate at that moment had dropped 17 points in 40 seconds, the body beginning to negotiate with itself. She did not negotiate. She stood up and kept moving. There was a second moment, somewhere between 8,200 and 8,000, where she could not locate the next fixed anchor in the white and stopped on a narrow ledge with the wind scouring her face and nothing visible in any direction. Her hands had stopped hurting. That was the information she was most careful about. Pain going silent was not improvement, and she understood that clearly. And so she moved toward the last bearing she had and found the anchor hardware by touch 40 seconds later and clipped in and kept moving. She did not remember most of the descent from 8,000 to 7,000. Her biometric log filled in what her memory didn't. Heart rate, core temperature trending down then stabilizing at 35 flat, pace having in the lower section when her left foot stopped cooperating. She had known, abstractly, that 3 of her toes were frostbitten past the point of sensation. She had not yet understood what that meant for her gait. She adjusted the gait and kept moving. At 6,200 meters, she reached the first fixed shelter band, where 2 of the authorities' emergency response teams had established a forward position. They had been waiting for survivors. They told her later that they had been on the verge of closing the position. The storm window, by their models, had pushed any remaining survivors above that band past the point where independent descent was possible. She had descended independently. The first responder who reached her on the slope was a Vethiri junior officer who later described, in his own deposition, the experience of watching a human emerge from the storm as something his training had not covered. She was moving, he said. She was not asking for help. She told him there was a survivor anchored at 8,600 meters with a failed supplemental unit, Shorvith, and that the retrieval window was closing. She gave the anchor coordinates from memory, precise to 10 meters. He had asked if she needed to stop first. She had told him she needed a rope. They went back up together for 400 meters, the junior officer and 2 members of the response team, and Myra Dane back into the remaining wind to where Shorvith was on the line. He was alive. Barely. They brought him down. Dresh stopped the recording. He sat for a moment with the apparatus between them, its indicator light still green. We recovered 13 bodies in the 4 days following the storm, he said. The Kethavoss route had 11 fatalities in its entire prior operating history. The summit attempt is under review. He paused. Shorvith is in critical care on the second level. They believe he will recover. Good, Myra said. I have additional questions for the formal record, but unofficial question first. He glanced at his apparatus, then back at her. Your biometric log shows 34.8 degrees core temperature when you reached the response station. The human medical literature I reviewed places 34 as the onset threshold for moderate hypothermia, yes. At 32, the literature characterizes the condition as I know what it characterizes. He stopped. Were you aware, during the descent, of how close the margins were? Myra considered the question. Outside the bay window, the station's orbital ring was visible, a pale arc against the dark, clean and far, and entirely unmoved by everything that had happened on the surface below it. I wasn't thinking about the margins, she said. I was thinking about the next anchor. Dresh was quiet. 14 of the 17 were not human, he said. 13 are dead. Of the 3 survivors, 1 is human. Myra said nothing. I don't have a framework, Dresh said, for what I just recorded. She looked at her bandaged hands. Outside, the orbital ring curved away into the dark, indifferent and permanent. You don't need one, she said. You just need the record. He picked up the apparatus. He turned off the indicator light. He left without asking his additional questions, and the formal record, when it was filed 3 days later, noted only that the deposition had been completed and that the human consultant's account was consistent with all available biometric data. It did not have a framework for her either. No one did. That, Myra had long since decided, was not her problem to solve.